In early 2007, Dairne and I did a tour of New Zealand's South Island. During the tour, I collected a lot of material and tried to put this into the form of an interactive log when I got back. It was a technical failure and the material has languished on my computers ever since then. Now, in 2016, I have finally got round to turning the material into a video. In order to get proper continuity, I have shamelessly stolen maps and street views from Google Earth. Otherwise, material was shot on my little compact Canon camera by Dairne and I. I hope you find it interesting. After a week or so staying with Ian, Claire and the twins in Auckland, we headed south in a hire car down one of the few dual carriageways in New Zealand. It does not last long. This road, just north of Cambridge, is more typical of the trunk road between Auckland and Wellington. We made a short overnight stop to visit Cree's sister Jan in Taupo. We had stayed with her before, where she kept a few horses. In the past, she has been quite involved with New Zealand show jumping teams. Always a pleasure to visit her. The next day we set off southwards again. After an hour, we approached Tongariro National Park. This is still the main trunk road between Auckland and Wellington. That mountain ahead is Ruapehu, which is an active volcano. It is also a major winter sports centre. On our right we could see Ungarahoe, which has a classic volcano shape. The next stage, commonly known as the Desert Road, took us past the active volcano of Ruapehu. We made a short picnic stop on the way before arriving at Wellington. The hire car was checked in and we boarded a ferry to Picton. It is at the top of Queen Charlotte Sound in South Island, one of the many spectacular Marlborough Sounds. The next stage of our journey would be a crossing of the Cook Strait. It was quite a rugged crossing. Eventually, we reached the shelter of Queen Charlotte Sound. It takes about 45 minutes to go right up the sound before reaching Picton. At Picton, we picked up a replacement hire car from the same company. The next leg would be along the north coast of South Island to the town of Nelson. We set off straight away along the coast road towards Havelock. This stretch of road is narrow and quite twisty, but is the only road between Picton and Nelson. It is not uncommon to meet large articulated vehicles on this road carrying goods or fuel, but it is interesting driving. There are wonderful views of the Marlborough Sounds as you drive along this road, especially before reaching Havelock. By now, the road had improved considerably, so meeting large tankers was not quite as perilous as it would have been before Havelock. Eventually, the road drops down to sea level. This road gives a very good idea of the general landscape that one will see in this part of South Island. Once we got to Nelson, we found a motel for the night. Later, we went down to the yacht club for a meal. It was very good. The next morning, we met up with Joanna, who had worked with me at ABP. She had married a chiropractor, and together they had immigrated to New Zealand and were now happily settled in Nelson. The next segment of the trip would take us from Nelson through another national park to Westport and Greymouth. The first part of the drive was along the floor of a wide valley. By now the terrain was becoming much more rugged, but it was a very good road. For a while, the road tracked along the Owen River Valley and was at times almost gorge-like. Eventually, the Owen River joined the Buller River, which wended its way down to the sea at Westport. We had plenty of time, so we diverted round the edge of Westport and found our way to Cape Foulwind. There is a well-marked tourist footpath to a viewing platform from which can be seen the resident group of seals hauled out and resting on the rocks. we managed to find a small restaurant on the beach where we enjoyed an excellent lunch. This was the first opportunity we had had to explore the Tasman coast, so in the afternoon we headed north, passing through Westport and along the coast on what was substantially an unsealed road. There were signs of development in the area, but this really is on the edge of the world. The views were amazing. We turned up one valley and climbed into the hills. Clearly some kind of property development was going on, but it felt very remote. Back to Westport for the night. The next segment would take us down the Tasman coast with a diversion at Wataroa to see the heronry that we had heard about from Peter and Maureen Shaw. Our first stop was at Pancake Rocks. This unusual geological mound must be very impressive when there are large seas rolling in from the Tasman. Caves in the rock reach up to the surface, so as the waves crash into the cave, spray shoots up through the vent holes. As on a previous visit, it was a calm day, but even so the performance was quite impressive. We proceeded further down the coast towards Greymouth, where we would spend the night at another motel. By the way, we never booked motels in New Zealand, as we found it was largely unnecessary at that time. Being early, we decided to take a diversion into the hinterland and took a swing past Lake Brunner before going back to Greymouth for the night. As we worked our way south along the coast the next morning, we came across this unusual bridge, which had a single carriageway and a single railway track on top of each other. Most unusual, but there are quite a few of these around the coast of New Zealand. The drive along the coast to Wataroa is fairly uneventful, though the bulk of the Southern Alps gradually appears over the skyline. This motel would be our base for the next day's expedition to the heronry. The coastal plain in this region is backed by the Southern Alps. Next morning, we found the boarding point for the bus to the heronry.
It is a great experience ahead, so be sure to make the most of it.
jet boat carries about 8 people and could do something like 20 knots in only a few inches of water. It was very much a part of the experience of getting to the heronry. Once at the heronry, there was a short walk through the trees to a well-built hide with a good view of the birds. In addition to the herons, there were some spoonbills, a few ducks and some other birds which we were unable to identify. We returned to Wataroa by the jet boat. We were now headed towards the area of the two big glaciers, Franz Josef and Fox. We had visited both the glaciers on an earlier visit, so we decided to go to only the Franz Josef Glacier on this expedition. The coastal plain is an area of temperate rainforest, so the path to the foot of the glacier is through a tunnel of lush green vegetation. Emerging from the trees, you are confronted with some quite large waterfalls. It seems odd to approach a glacier through such greenery. Walking back to the car, we saw for the first time this truly magnificent rata tree. On the road south, the mountains present a continuous backdrop. Fox Glacier was clearly visible, but we drove past. The roadside vegetation was getting thicker. Now the road turned inland to attack the Haast Pass. At first, the pass rises quite gently, still passing through thick green undergrowth. There are a few bridges which are basically one lane only. The gorge became narrower and the climb steeper. Halfway up the pass we paused to look at a waterfall and cascade. The descent on the east side is simpler, not so steep, and with much less undergrowth at the roadside.
right corner.
For a short while, the road goes along the shore of Lake Wanaka. The Lake Hawea shore leads further south until the road curves away to deliver you to Wanaka. There we found a motel and were ready for a good meal after a long day. We were now on the edge of our main goal, Fiordland. We were now approaching Fiordland, the wildest and most rugged part of New Zealand. After an overnight stay in Wanaka, we would make our way to Queenstown using the Cardrona Valley Road rather than the main road, in the hope that it would give us more interesting scenic views. We would only make a short stop in Queenstown, the home of bungee jumping, before going on to Te Anau, which is the springboard for visiting the two major tourist sounds, Milford and Doubtful. Five years previously, we had visited both sounds, but the weather had been dire. This meant that the waterfalls were dramatic, but we were hoping to see the sounds in better weather. Of the two sounds, we had found Doubtful Sound the more impressive and decided to make that the focus of our visit this time. Wanaka is an attractive lakeside town famous for its annual air show at which numerous vintage aircraft are displayed. Leaving Wanaka, we set off up the Cardrona Valley. It is a good quality road, but the valley is fairly featureless until the road starts to descend very steeply, revealing panoramic views over the mountains. At the bottom of the descent, Queenstown sits by the lakeside, tight under a very steep hill. We did not intend to stay in Queenstown, which is the centre for a lot of crazy outdoor sports invented by the Kiwis, including whitewater rafting and bungee jumping, neither of which appeals to either of us. But we did go up by cable car so that we could get an aerial view of the area. There were numerous people kite flying, taking advantage of the updrafts created by the steep hillsides. I tend to suffer from vertigo and do not like trusting myself to being suspended over a large drop by a single cable, but the view was worth it.
This gondola may slow or even stop. Don't be alarmed. We will have you underway as soon as possible. Well, that's because
I read that.
Now we've got to prepare to get on.
Carrying on from Queenstown, we drove along the side of Lake Wakatipu before turning west along a wide flat-bottomed valley till we reached the town of Te Anau. Having found a motel, we went out to a restaurant for the evening. We joined the tour bus in Te Anau for the first short drive to the lakeside town of Manapuri. At Manapuri, we boarded a catamaran ferry for the 30-minute trip across Lake Manapuri. The lake provides the water for a hydroelectric power station built inside the mountain. Indeed, the tourist route that we were now taking was opened up by the building of the power station. After disembarking from the ferry, we boarded a bus that was clearly built for tackling rugged tracks and unsealed roads. After only a few minutes, the bus diverted into the power station and descended several hundred feet using the spiral tunnel. We had visited the power station before, but were happy to see it again because it is such an interesting piece of civil engineering. The power station takes water from Lake Manapuri, passes it through the turbines, then discharges it into Doubtful Sound at the rate of about 6 tons per minute. It takes about 20 minutes for the bus to go from the power station to the head of Doubtful Sound.
It's actually a steeper section of the road that we'll travel on today. Grade here about 1 and 5. So every 5 metres forward, we descend 1 metre. As you make your way down, notice quite a rapid change in the vegetation. A lot more like temperate rainforest on this western side. Many more plants that enjoy these warmer, sort of more humid conditions. See a lot more ferns and such like start to appear.
The weather was better than on our last visit. Even so, there were many huge waterfalls. The boat trip on Doubtful Sound lasts for nearly 2 hours. The scenery is extreme, with trees clinging to steep mountainsides. Quite a few of the scars on the hillsides are due to tree avalanches. The soil in which the trees grow is very thin, so in heavy rain and wind, it only takes a few trees near the top to let go, and a tree avalanche is inevitable. Once the Tasman Sea became visible, a slight swell was working into the sound. This is obviously a popular hauling out rock for the local seal population. As the boat started the return journey, the sun started to peep through. Halfway back, the ferry diverted into the Crooked Arm. If anything, it is steeper and more dramatic than the main sound. The bus retraced its path to Lake Manapuri. Vegetation changes quite rapidly as you pass the summit of the road. The ferry was standing by for the return trip across Lake Manapuri. We had had a long day, so we spent a restful evening in the motel. The next phase of our journey would be a diagonal transit of South Island to Blenheim to visit the Marlborough Wine Festival, which happened to be on at the same time. We departed from Dairne, retracing our steps along the valley floor towards Queenstown. The road along the side of Lake Wakatipu is quite winding, but it is very pleasant all the way up to Queenstown. This time we took the main road northwards, stopping briefly at a motel in Cromwell where we found an excellent restaurant for the evening. The next morning we continued the long drive up through central Otago. On a previous visit we had driven along the shores of Lake Pukaki to the foot of Mount Cook, but on this occasion we just stopped at the southern end of Lake Pukaki and admired the view. It was a relatively easy journey from there to Fairlie, where we found an excellent motel for the night. It had been quite a long day, which tends to show in this photograph. Next morning we were determined to make it all the way to Blenheim to get there in time to visit the wine festival. The early part of the journey was across the flat Canterbury Plain. The bypass to the west of Christchurch is possibly the only dual carriageway in the whole of South Island outside the town centre. As we approached the wild coast road that clings to the edge of the mountain on the way to Kaikoura, the weather deteriorated. A brief stop was made at Kaikoura to purchase a couple of crayfish, but the weather did not tempt us to linger. On reaching Blenheim, we went to the Montana winery, partly because we liked the wine and partly so that Dairne could revisit one of the most magnificent public loos in the southern hemisphere. That evening we cooked the crayfish in the motel. We found the Marlborough Wine Festival site and had a most enjoyable day there, tasting, observing the fun and admiring the fashions that looked as though they had been selected by Oxfam. Back into Blenheim for a restful night. Because of the wine festival we had some time on our hands, but we decided to go back to the Picton area. It is quite an interesting drive through the mountain pass to Picton. Picton is a pretty town, but we found a motel just east of the town overlooking Queen Charlotte's Sound for the night. We had had a vague plan to revisit the Marlborough Sounds for our final day, but the coastal route from Picton to Blenheim looked like it would be interesting driving, albeit on unsealed roads much of the way, so that is the option we chose. Almost immediately, the road becomes spectacular, narrow and very twisty. After Watamango Bay, the road is unsealed. Occasionally you get a rest from the frantic driving as you cross a wider bay. This is Robin Hood Bay.
How do I know if it's taking it?
Down the bottom right you'll see it counting up 1, 2, 3, 4.
I can't, I've got the glasses.
Well, I heard it bleep, so... Count slowly up to about 30. So this is the run from Picton round the coast towards Blenheim.
How do I stop it?
Push the same button. 1 second. Interesting thing here. Finally, the road descends to the wide flat delta of the Wairau Valley. We chose to revisit the Whitehaven winery because we had had an excellent Sauvignon Blanc there a few years previously. On this occasion the vintage was not quite so good, but it is a wine I buy in England when on offer. The next morning we retraced our steps via the main road to Picton, where we checked in the hire car and boarded the ferry to Wellington. Once we had found the Apex office, we drove to a motel just outside Wellington that we had used before, where once again Dairne enjoyed an excellent lamb shank. A stop for morning coffee offered an irresistible chance to consume a large chunk of carrot cake. That evening, after passing Ruapehu and Lake Taupo, we visited John and Kerrin in Rotorua. John had stayed with us in England for a few weeks when getting his overseas experience, something that is almost a rite of passage for Kiwi teenagers. We were made most welcome and enjoyed a short walk in the redwood plantation on the edge of Rotorua. The final day of our expedition was a dash up the road to Ian and Claire's house in Auckland. It is close to the airport, which made dropping the hire car back to Apex very easy. Altogether, a good trip and one we shall remember for a long time.